Hi, everyone. I'm Sadaf. This is Nathan.
Hello.
No downloading on computers. Welcome to the computer lab.
Welcome to the computer lab. Actually, yeah, the sign, I spent a lot of money printing the sign. It's actually completely cut off, but it says no downloading on computers with two exclamation marks.
Yeah, it was part of a much bigger sign.
I printed it like 7 feet long by mistake.
Yeah.
That was unfortunate.
Yeah, you used the wrong dimensions.
Yeah. So we're here to discuss, we're here to intro part 2 of our 3-part interview with Dr. Chris Alton, PhD.
That's right. And I guess, so we'll be talking about Resident Evil 4 in this part.
4, yes.
Resident Evil 4, about escort missions, because in Resident Evil 4, it's mostly an escort mission.
A huge part of the game is an extended escort mission, which I had never thought of. I don't necessarily have the same allergic reaction to escort missions that a lot of people have. But yeah, a huge part of Resident Evil 4 is you're helping Ashley stumble her way through the dangers of some sort of spooky experience.
Yeah, for sure. And like for all sorts of reasons, I know you and I don't really think of Resident Evil 4 as an escort mission. And I think that's probably because Ashley's AI just isn't as frustrating as someone like Natalia from GoldenEye. She's not always running into walls and like lagging behind, right?
Absolutely.
But before we get into that, I do have one question for you.
Oh, let's do this.
Okay. So behind you, there's a poster. It says Rules for a New Millennium.
Rules for a New Millennium.
Yeah, and there's one that stood out to me. What does it mean when you say fictional characters are not real people?
Yes, fictional characters are not real people.
Tell us.
That sign's been there since day one of this podcast.
And no one's asked?
We haven't really discussed it. These are my rules for a new millennium. They're not anyone else's. Okay. But fictional characters are not real people. This is important to me because on the surface, it sounds like maybe a sort of obnoxious reactionary argument against any criticism of media. But I actually mean the opposite. I think that if you were to just walk outside and like take a picture of a crowd, you wouldn't necessarily be on the hook for what that crowd looks like, if that makes any sense. Whereas if you were to draw a picture, everything you're doing is a choice. Within limits, like absolutely everything is political, right? Yeah. And so I think, this is true when we're talking about film. Like I would argue that the director of a film is essentially just painting on a blank canvas. With gaming, I think that conversation is almost happening in more of a vacuum. I think anyone who's built a model for a video game knows you open 3ds Max or Blender or whatever. You start with a cube or you start with nothing and you just start extruding that cube and subdividing. And eventually you draw a woman or a man or a castle or a sword or whatever it is.
Or a box.
A box. Actually, a lot of sort of entry-level work in game modeling is making crates because every game has a bunch of crates and barrels. So.
Personally, I really judge a game by its crates and barrels.
Yeah, how do they feel?
Yeah.
Are they convincing?
Yeah.
I think the best is GoldenEye. Like, if the crates in your game don't explode, I'm not interested. But all of which to say, when you make a video game character, you are starting from a blank canvas. So everything that character looks like is a choice.
Yes.
So if we're talking about Dead or Alive Xtreme Beach Volleyball, which I think we mentioned in the last intro, but
very deliberate choices.
The choices of that are quite clear. And we talk about like Bayonetta. I think there's an attempt to defend the choices in that game. Like, of course, Bayonetta has to get naked when she attacks. That's the lore. And it's like, well, the lore is just something you invented on a blank piece of paper.
Yeah, you're not honoring like 1,000 year of like traditions by whatever ethno-religious group from however many
Well, it's not based on something.
It's not based on something.
Yeah.
No, it's not.
Yeah, so when you sit down to create a character, you are making all these choices that are deliberate choices. Even if you're not aware of what you're doing, you're still on the hook for those choices. And so when we talk about Resident Evil 4, which is mostly what we discussed today, Ashley, someone sat down at probably 3ds Max or Maya and created Ashley. And I know the lore is she's supposed to be like 25. She's coded as like a middle schooler, if we're being honest. And it's weird that like they've added...
She looks like a high school girl, yeah.
And they've added like scripted events for like you looking up her skirt, which...
Yes.
I want to say on the record, I was not aware that was a thing because I don't go doing that in video games. I'm not one of these sick freaks.
You don't do it in real life either.
I also don't do it in real life.
Yeah.
Which is the lowest of bars to clear. But I'm putting that on my resume. Anyway, there's things in Resident Evil 4 about how that character is coded and then how she relates to Leon, not to mention other kind of more obvious stuff about some of the dialogue that's been under criticism over the years. So I guess getting back to the quote, fictional characters, not real people, nothing happens by accident in a video game. Everything in a game was created from zero. Every line of dialogue was, you had to cast people, you had to hire a writer, the writer had to write the lines, it had to, there's so many revisions, everything is a choice. And that, for me, is why media criticism is worth doing.
That's why we're doing this podcast, or why maybe you're doing it.
that's
That's part of why I'm here today to talk about it.
That's why we built this computer lab, to discuss these very issues.
Yep. I guess we can jump ahead into the podcast.
Yeah.
Please enjoy.
Roll the clip. I guess that sort of brings us into looking ahead to Resident Evil 4. When you started talking about the escort mission of most of that game, you mentioned that there wasn't a whole lot of writing on escort missions from a gender perspective, which honestly I found shocking, because I think escort missions are such a unanimously hated thing, I feel like. So it's interesting there wasn't a lot of discourse on that academically. But I guess broadly, like, why do you think that gap exists? Do you think it's a general focus on the power of images and how things are portrayed visually, or is that, what would you chalk that up to?
So, okay, this isn't to say that there's no discussion of that. I know that I've mentioned Sarah Stang's work on BioShock Infinite, and I think The Walking Dead was what came up. And she has continued working on stuff like that. Like, she's currently in the game design department at Brock right now. So she's working on that while also looking at how to discuss escort missions from a game design perspective. And then there's Gerald Voorhees' work on datification, which takes the idea of the escort mission and looks at the modern version where, like, say, God of War, you play as a father protecting a child, and going back to The Walking Dead, not necessarily a father, but a father figure. And it's like, as game devs have gotten older and had kids and had them grow up to be like little humans as opposed to squishy pieces of goo. Sorry, is that too crass?
No, I love it.
But yeah, as they've gotten older, as they've become parents themselves, they're like, oh, we should incorporate that into the games. But it's still the same dynamic where you're still playing the empowered male character protecting the character who can't protect themselves. And like, Sarah's work kind of argues against that, but in a weird way. She and I have had debates about this. Too much to go into here, but I think part of the situation with escort missions is because everyone hates them, everyone's familiar with them, and they've become such a running gag or a meme, I don't want to say there isn't as much impetus to discuss them, but speaking personally, I haven't found that much work on them. So if there's someone listening who is familiar with more work on escort missions and would be willing to share, please let me know. Or if you want to collaborate with me on an academic discourse on escort missions, let me know.
What I think it's funny you talk about how, I guess, just the degree to which they're not liked, or they're kind of a joke in the industry. It's like, I think of the work Anita Sarkeesian did to bring light to a lot of tropes in video games that were gendered, and how that like led to actual material changes in game development. Whereas I feel like escort missions just got bullied out of existence. I feel like it almost begs the question, like, what is the work that needs to be done here? Which I'd be fascinated to see if anyone does want to write about that.
Well, the thing is, escort missions didn't really get bullied out of existence. They're still here. Like I said, God of War Ragnarok. I know that there are escort missions in Horizon Zero Dawn. See, this is the thing with mostly playing games for research and for my YouTube channel. I haven't played a lot of recent games because I've been so focused on research and recording. Yeah. So it's hard for me to pull additional modern examples. But like, the shift isn't from like Resident Evil 4 or Eco or whatever, where you play the male protagonist protecting the helpless female character. It's shifted to you play the male parent protecting the helpless child. So actually, you know what? Let's go with an example that everyone's going to be familiar with, whether they've played the game or not, because they've probably seen the HBO show, The Last of Us.
Sure.
Yeah.
Both Last of Us games are essentially extended escort missions. The only difference is that they've taken the teeth out of them because let's look at the first one. Ellie cannot be hurt and cannot be detected by the enemies.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. Naughty Dog wanted to take the frustration out of the escort mission, so she's there and she can help, sort of, but you're essentially on your own. If she's sticking out, the enemies will not see her. They will see you because Joel is who you're in control of, but Ellie is just kind of a blank slate.
So would you say it's like, I guess that type of level has evolved. It's the optics are certainly better. Like rather than escorting a seemingly incompetent full-grown woman like GoldenEye, for example, it's now we're packing on more reasons for this character to not be able to help themselves through, like, as you say, parentage as the means instead.
Yeah, and it's actually really funny you bring up GoldenEye because I'm actually working on my extremely late holiday video on the Wii remake of GoldenEye.
Oh, nice.
Where like they actually translate it into the Daniel Craig timeline, so it's an adaptation, like Spectre was an adaptation of Bond versus Blofeld. And so it's this weird transitional thing where it's clear that the devs knew that Natalia is the bane of players' existence. So instead of doing something like making her immune to damage or making the enemies focus on Bond, particularly because they do still have the control room sequence where the enemies target her to try to keep her from redirecting the GoldenEye satellite, for most of the points where you escorted her through the levels in the original N64 game, she's just gone. Like in the jungle levels, when you're getting to the hidden GoldenEye operations base, she's not there because she was kidnapped on the train and taken there by the bad guys. So it's this weird in-between where it's like, okay, people hate escort missions, so let's remove those entirely. But then this makes Natalia seem even more helpless because she didn't even get there on her own. So what do we do? And so that's how we get to things like BioShock Infinite, where Elizabeth doesn't take damage. We get Ellie, who is basically a blank slate for the enemies. I'm actually of two minds about this, because this is something I was thinking about earlier because of the GoldenEye video. It's like, in theory, I appreciate what the escort mission is doing, because it's more than just trying to get the player to shoot. It is trying to get the player to demonstrate empathy, demonstrate concern for someone or something other than themselves.
Oh, like it changes that pace of it.
Yeah. And you know what? I am all in on that. That is a great idea. It's just that a lot of the implementation tends to fall along certain gender lines or fall along certain tropes in terms of gameplay. And like the implementation isn't there. And that actually got me thinking about the Barry Jill dynamic, because I think what would be interesting would be having a game where it is an extended escort mission like Resident Evil 4, but where you are not playing as the escort. You are playing as the person being escorted. So you have to hide while the other person takes everything out. You have to make sure that you're not captured without having the capabilities of the person who's supposed to be looking after you. And so shift that dynamic so you get to see the other side of that and build empathy from a different perspective, if that makes sense.
That would be a cool take on it. It's funny what you say about the GoldenEye remake, because I feel like that game's one generation later, I believe, in terms of hardware. Like, they could have fixed the AI, but no, they decided to like make the gender stuff worse, and then also kind of fix the gameplay. But that's such a funny solution to me.
Oh, yeah. Well, technically 2 generations, because it's on the Wii.
But not GameCube, the Wii, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So you mentioned something in your dissertation that actually completely surprised me, because, I mean, just to set up what Resident Evil 4 is, like, it's been re-released many times with little iterative changes each time. And I've never actually played the GameCube version, but I've played, I think, every version since. And you mentioned that Ashley in the original North American release had like DOA style like breast physics, which is quite a thing for a variety of reasons. But I wonder on your end, I guess this is kind of a two-parter question, but were there any difficulties in writing about a game that was so iterative and that had such significant changes over, like, even excluding the remake, like that game was changed a lot of times? Was that tricky when you were writing the dissertation at all?
It was, but okay, in terms of the breast physics thing, I can't take credit for that. When I was doing research and when I was looking for material to discuss about Resident Evil 4, I just kind of stumbled upon a video that breaks down the change. Like, saying it out loud, it sounds creepy as hell, but there's a video that breaks down the breast physics in a bunch of the releases to that point.
Oh, I believe it.
People got time on
Like,
their hands to do that.
Yeah. Like it's critical of the early DOA breast physics boobs don't work that way, but at the same time, that's work that was both interesting and that I didn't have to do myself. Because like I played through the GameCube version and the HD re-release, and I didn't really notice that, partially because I was more focused on trying to keep Ashley from being killed.
It's probably a good thing.
Yeah. Like I did notice some of the other stuff that was intentionally thrown into the game, like standing at the base of a ladder while Ashley's climbing it. She will tell you not to peek up her skirt. But yeah, that particular thing. Sorry, I'm just going through my sources because it's been a few years.
Of course, yeah.
I will give credit where credit is due.
Well, I to your point about some of the things that have changed, like I got into the Oculus version of Resident Evil 4, which no one has to like. I think VR is a complicated thing, but I thought it was pretty good. But I looked up some of the reviews, and a lot of people were very hung up on they removed like some lines of dialogue about looking up her skirt. I just like, who is concerned about this sort of thing? Like there were people who were mad that was removed. I just thought, like, what a thing to even care about at all. But that just shocked me. Like there's some weird videos out there by strange people.
Yeah, and the thing is, I don't even think that it was people who liked the she thinks you're a pervert thing. It's more of there are hardcore fans who want everything to remain as pure as possible, and so like any change is going to be met with a vitriolic reaction. When the 2002 Resident Evil remake was released and the Jill sandwich line was changed to "You were almost squashed flat enough to fit into a sandwich," people got mad about that as well because it's not what they remembered. And
right.
Just quick aside, the video was by Censored Gaming, and it's titled Resident Evil 4 Censorship. So that's the one that looks at the boob physics and compares them across regions and releases. And although it's from 2016, so some of the more recent releases obviously aren't included.
Sure, yeah.
I guess I wonder how much, because, there's a politics to nostalgia. I wonder whether people getting upset over changes to an older video game, if they're aware that they're being toxic and reactionary, like they're doing, that they're doing it on purpose, or whether there's a genuine feeling of nostalgia, that they want to maintain something that they remember. And of course, I think that's being generous, because I think nostalgia can very easily be weaponized. But yeah, what do you make of that?
A lot of the backlash around these games is, yes, it's a sense of nostalgia, but it's also a sense of gatekeeping. Because you've got these people who, if you change anything at all, it's like, that's not mine anymore. Now other people are doing this. And so you get this anger that it's not for you anymore. And so general you for the people who, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
This isn't for me anymore, and I need to lash out because how am I going to stop it? Otherwise, my power's being taken away. But the thing is, like, removing that line and removing the one that a lot of people weirdly got angry about was the ballistics line.
Which I don't remember that line at all, but apparently it was in the game.
Oh, yeah. I can't believe I'm blanking on the character's name right now. Luis, yeah. Yeah. When they're trapped in the cabin, when it's initially being besieged by Los Ganados, he takes time out to comment on her bust. And yeah, that's cheesy. Yeah, you would see that in like a B movie, but particularly with the remakes and the more heavy tone that they're taking, it's out of place. And just throwing it in there would be more incongruous than changing it or leaving it out because we're fighting for our lives. I'm not going to comment on your rack.
Yeah, the genre's different now, right? It's less B movie.
Yeah, well, partially because it can afford to be. Let's be real. A lot of horror games from around when Resident Evil came out, and a lot of which were inspired by Resident Evil, were still low budget, fast productions because nobody had any faith in horror. Horror has always been the redheaded stepchild of genres because it's always been seen as a low genre. Hell, the review of David Cronenberg's first feature film was titled, "You Should Know How Awful This Movie Is. After All, You Paid For It," because he got government art subsidies to make it.
Oh, that would be controversial. Yeah.
Yeah. So,
Oh, man.
yeah, horror's always been seen as this low genre. And so it has, there are waves where horror peaks and gets lots of popularity and big budgets and all of that. But there are also low periods where it's disparaged. It's like, ew, why would anyone deal with this trash? And like, we know why people would deal with this, but we still get shoestring budgets. We still get rushed productions. And so if you get the chance to improve, why wouldn't you? I know that's slightly controversial because that can easily dance into George Lucas territory. And that's not what I mean.
We're talking about above shoestring, not quite, Jar Jar necessarily.
Yeah, exactly. Times change, stories change with them, and the people who don't want them to change don't want them to change because they want a particular dynamic, whether it's gender, status, whatever, and they're afraid of losing that as opposed to the idea of someone else gaining that as well.
That's a really good way of putting it. I mean, you just brought us into the next question, which is a really interesting one for me because my background is also in film, and not to digress too much, but you talk about how Nkai Kroll interviewed the developers and sort of got out of them that a big influence on Resident Evil 5 was Raiders of the Lost Ark. And as you quite hilariously point out, they're depicting Africa, some vague African country, but like referencing Raiders of the Lost Ark's depiction of South American indigenous peoples, which is a whole thing. But it really, the way you put it kind of made me think, not to overload the question too much, but, to be nostalgic for Raiders of the Lost Ark, Spielberg was nostalgic when he made that. And he was hearkening back to serials of the 30s and 40s, which were themselves often about like ongoing genocides that America was committing. And so I find that when games borrow from big budget movies, it's like, how are you not being more critical of the images you're borrowing? These have a history. Well, that one article was literally called "These Images Have a History." What do you make of how that keeps happening in gaming? How people just lift from American movies without any thought to kind of the cultural violence that's happening?
Let's talk about Spielberg and Lucas for a moment because they were absolutely making movies based on nostalgia for their childhoods. And so the thing is, they were also pulling from stuff that they got in film school that they were like, oh, this is really good stylistically, regardless of where it comes from. Mm-hmm. So I'm thinking of a very specific example here. If you're familiar with the original 1977 Star Wars, and specifically the award ceremony at the end.
Oh, was that Olympia?
Sorry?
Oh, sorry. Are you getting into like Lenny Riefenstahl stuff? Or I'm curious where you're going with this. Sorry.
Yep. Okay, that is exactly what I'm getting into. Because that award ceremony is pulled almost shot for shot from Riefenstahl's The Triumph of the Will because it looked good. Never mind that it was originally a Nazi ceremony. It just looked good on camera. So so you get the same thing. And a lot of games are fairly shameless in that they're pulling from inspirations from older media, particularly when you're talking about like the 80s, the 90s, because you've got all of these developers who are seeing these movies or reading these comics and are like, I really wish I could do that. So why don't I do that? I mean, there's a reason we got a bunch of Space Marines after 1986's Aliens. Like everything from Doom Guy to Master Chief to I can list off so many different Space Marines, but all of them owe a debt to 1986's Aliens. And this is something... The thing is, though, that gets complicated because Cameron has said outright that movie is an allegory for the Vietnam War. Mm-hmm. Which, on the surface, is like, oh, hey, okay, that's clever. Until you stop to think about it. Because if that's an allegory for the Vietnam War, not only do you have American-coded colonists, because they all talk in American accents. You have American Space Marines, so American Marines, and they're the good guys.
That is a problem, yeah.
Yeah, especially when the opposition are framed as this unknowable, literally alien, unstoppable killing force. The xenomorphs are not given any sort of character or drive outside of reproduction and eradication. So that allegory gets really uncomfortable really quickly. And so much of gaming imagery is built off of that.
I'd say that's pretty chilling.
Yeah.
You really when you
It's
when you
scary,
put it
yeah.
up that way, yeah.
So, like, on the one hand, I totally understand this is such a cool thing from my childhood. I want to be able to experience it myself. This is how we can experience it. On the other hand, maybe we should stop and think about what's actually going on with this before we just replicate it as something that we're encouraging players to do.
Yeah. I guess looking at Resident Evil 7, obviously you point out that the films they're drawing from are usually less bad about gender, so there is an improvement in Resident Evil 7 overall. But I guess my question for you about how that game changes its pace so drastically, and I think becomes closer to the spirit of the original games, is that I almost wonder if a lot of that has to do with the fact that adventure games really died in the early 2000s and were replaced by heavy action, fast action, shoot 'em ups. Do you think that the developers really always wanted early on to be more action focused and were limited by hardware? Or do you think Resident Evil evolved because puzzle games, like point and click adventure, the LucasArts model, do you think those games just died and they thought, well, we have to pivot to action? I'm curious what you think happened there.
Okay, I'm not so sure about the point and click, because obviously the Resident Evil puzzles pull from that sort of dynamic, especially with the weird, this piece goes here, this piece goes there, and it doesn't necessarily need to make logical sense. It's just within the confines of this imaginary world. But let's be real. There's always been a fair amount of gunplay in the Resident Evil series. And this is actually something that I found myself thinking about earlier today while I was walking down the street. It's like the first game, you are playing as either a military-trained pseudo-SWAT member or a military-trained pseudo-SWAT member. The second game, you're playing as either a police officer or someone who was exposed to a military-trained SWAT officer. The third game, you're playing as one of the characters from the first game. And like, even for a second, I thought that Resident Evil Survivor had the first protagonist who wasn't military, police, or military or police adjacent.
Wow.
Because he's a journalist. But at the same time, he says at the end, once he gets his memory back, that he's close personal friends with Leon Kennedy. So he's still police adjacent.
A full switch at the end, yeah.
Yeah. And so 3, you play as Jill. Gaiden, you play as Barry and Leon. 4, you play as Leon. 5, you play as Chris and Sheva, both of whom are now paramilitary. 6, you play as, it's Leon, Chris, Sherry, and Wesker's son, or Ada, all of whom have gotten military training. 7 may actually be the first game where you play as a non-military character. Because Ethan Winters is, a documentary filmmaker? Or is he a reporter? I can't remember at the moment.
I think he's making a doc, or someone is in that game.
Yeah, I know that at the beginning they're filming like a cheesy reality show. I think he's a reporter. The military trained person, and again, spoilers here, but the military trained person is actually Mia, and he's going in to try to save her. So I think he might be the first protagonist who doesn't have gun training. That's a long-winded way of me getting to the point that the series has always had a certain amount of action focus to it. And especially in the wake of Devil May Cry being spun out into its own thing because it was originally supposed to be Resident Evil 4, I feel like there are influences there that were pushing the series towards more action even before the slower paced approach was falling out of vogue. At the same time, like even pre-Resident Evil, Mikami had a weirdly diverse gaming history to that point. Like, he made Goof Troop. He actually mostly made Disney games. Goof Troop,
interesting.
The SNES version of Aladdin, the Game Boy version of Who Framed Roger Rabbit. So it's possible that he just wanted to shift genres, and that's what happened. Because I know that some of the early builds, and setting aside Devil May Cry, some of the other early builds still played, like specifically Code Veronica, where yes, you've got the dual wielding and all of that, but it's still set camera angles, tank controls, all of that. Like, I absolutely agree that the adventure game definitely fell out of fashion and almost died out completely in the 2000s. But I'm not sure if that's what pushed Resident Evil towards the more action-oriented approach, or if it was the attempt to westernize it more than it already was.
Okay. Because that's where we get 6 with... I've been told 6 has a lot of like Michael Bay influences in it, right? Especially with Chris's thing.
Oh my, yeah. Well, with all of them, like with Leon's supposedly horror-oriented approach, you still have an entire massive city street that erupts in explosions because a tanker blows up, which then blows up a bunch of the other abandoned cars, and you're fighting an enemy that's attached itself to a fighter jet. And it is like an 80s Stallone movie in that it's over the top. So yeah, the entire game was over the top, and there are some weird, going back to the question about movie influences, there are some weird influences there as well. Like in Leon's campaign, the caverns underneath the Midwestern American town that have the corpses of Roman soldiers. Like there is no way that Roman soldiers would have been in the Americas at that point. And it feels very much like they were trying to, I don't know, go for a Goonies thing or go for another Indiana Jones reference with like Last Crusade. And it has a fever dream feel to it.
Right, yeah.
So I don't know if that concretely answers your question, but I also don't know that I can concretely answer it.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I'm asking you to speculate on the intent of people you've never met, but that is a really good answer. I mean, if we're going into the notion that game hardware evolved and they were able to maybe go a bit faster with their action, because as you say, like the characters are always military training, Bravo Force, whatever. I have this this is me talking armchair, but I have this theory that in the lead up to 3D graphics getting faster, you have a lot of women game developers and also games that were very successful that a lot of women enjoyed playing. So I'm thinking of The Sims and Myst are the best-selling games of the 90s. And then as soon as the turn of the millennium happens, it's like games are for dudes and you shoot up whole countries in Call of Duty. And it's not until indie games really find their footing online that we start to get games that are not Call of Duty, essentially. And I wonder if that's what gets us to Resident Evil 7 having this Gone Home influence, is that games just kind of became very, very masculine, very, I would say, toxic and violent in the 2000s. How far off am I with this theory, do you think?
I think it escalated. Let's be real. The game industry has always had an issue with toxic masculinity. Well, okay, no, that's not entirely fair. From the late 70s onward. Like there's a reason Roberta Williams had to appear nude in a hot tub in the ads for one of her own games in order to try to sell it.
Did that happen?
Yeah.
Jesus.
Yep.
Oh.
Yep. Early 80s.
But she doesn't even make those kind of games. Not that it makes it okay, but like, what the hell?
Yep.
Well, that's the whole thing.
Yeah, I discovered that in computer gaming world. I don't remember the issue, but they actually reprinted the ad because like you can't see anything, obviously, because it's supposed to be a mass market ad, but it's still trying to sell her games based on her being nude in a hot tub full of bubbles. So that sort of thing has always been an issue, but you're right. It did escalate in the 2000s, particularly with the release of the Wii, because while the Wii opened up gaming to a lot of people, we'll set aside the whole discussion about how the Wii is horribly inaccessible for people with disabilities for the moment. That's a different discussion to be had. With the Wii opening up gaming demographics, that's when you get the whole core versus casual debate, which
I remember that, yeah.
Oh, God, that is such a tiresome debate because it is based entirely around gatekeeping and who gets to call themselves a gamer. Everyone gets to call themselves a gamer.
Yes.
This isn't a debate we should be having, but because there's that gatekeeping there, and going back to what we were talking about earlier, the fear of change leading to a loss of power and status, you get this concentration of toxic masculinity. And so when the indie space starts to go around that with smaller budget games that don't have to worry about catering to the largest demographic, And so once you get the rise of indie gaming and smaller developers, smaller studios that aren't as concerned about market demographics and just want to tell their stories and are just bypassing this whole core versus casual debate and the standard mid-30s brown-haired white male protagonist,
Yeah.
and they're successful, then you start to see that shift apply to larger games. Admittedly, with some of the stuff that's come out since, thank you very much, Fulbright Company, for not being great.
Oh, I'm actually not familiar with what happened there.
Oh, okay. So one of the founders actually turned out to be incredibly toxic and would abuse employees during the development of games like Gone Home, while being one of the public faces and being like, no, we don't embrace the toxic corporate culture of major studios like EA. We're a family here.
Oh, no.
Yeah, he just failed to include the word dysfunctional there.
Well, I mean, most families are.
Yeah, I can't argue that. But even then, just these different stories being told influences the long-running series that are continuing to try to evolve. And so you can even... I know I mentioned Bogost's article on walking simulators.
Yes, yeah, you do.
I didn't necessarily want to get into this because he keeps gatekeeping about what is not considered a game.
Oh, it's a terrible term, walking simulator, even though it is somewhat helpful, but it's very malicious in intent, right?
It's malicious in intent. It's designed to other and minimize the experiences. And he has written multiple articles on what can and cannot be considered games, which is just another level of gatekeeping, especially considering he invokes Janet Murray's Hamlet on the holodeck without actually crediting her for it and only crediting male colleagues. Not a good time.
That's bad. Yeah.
It's unfortunate.
Yeah. So like there's still these issues around gatekeeping, gendered gatekeeping, even with these new experiences that are influencing these mainstream experiences. So I also think you are correct in terms of the adventure game idea, in that adventure games traditionally have a larger female audience.
I would agree, yeah.
As with a lot of stuff in the modern day, you get a very loud, very vociferous, but small group of male players who are talking about how it's their space, but it's really not, and it never was. And so part of the contraction of the adventure game genre in the 2000s, again, this is speculation on my part, but it feels like it's tied to that core versus casual debate, especially considering if you look at the Wii's game catalog, you get a lot of hidden object games. You get those point and click games. That is where Telltale started out with, of all things, Strong Bad.
Yeah.
Is the Wiimote, again, for all of the inaccessibility for players with disabilities, was perfect for point and click games. Yes, it was good for first person shooters, but it also allowed for other experiences like point and click for people who didn't necessarily want to get onto a computer, use a mouse, whatever. They could sit down, hold a remote, and play these games. So that is where these adventure games went. And that just contributed to the whole, the Wii is for filthy casuals, when, again, no, stop being a trash bag.
Yeah. I mean, whenever I hear that argument, I think of, it's a very specific post, but someone had a picture of their, I think, grandma's 3DS with the Animal Crossing, and it was like 400 hours of Animal Crossing. It's like,
yeah,
that is not casual play. That is, not that the distinction matters, but that is serious gaming by any measure.
Yeah. And again, it's always been like that. I remember an issue of Nintendo Power from 1990 where a 76-year-old grandmother wrote in talking about how she was the one who played through Dragon Warrior. Like, her grandson got it with his subscription to Nintendo Power, but she was the one who beat it.
I love that.
Right?
Yeah.
Like, retirement goals.
Right. That's the thing. I realized like how internalized that idea is of who is and isn't a gamer, because I remember Nathan and I were talking about, whether or not, oh, like, do you play video games? Like, yeah, I do. I guess I do. But I'm like, I wouldn't consider myself a gamer. And he said, why not? And I'm like, oh, that's a good question. Because I realized a lot of the games that I played growing up, like I played a lot of mainstream games, a lot of the things that maybe like my older brothers were into, and I would just sort of pick up when they weren't playing and they're out. And I realized, oh, well, just because I play The Sims or I like playing, I don't know, some of the Lego games, like it doesn't matter. I'm still playing games. It's even the way between Nathan and I, how we play games, it's like I will sit there and painstakingly go through every single room, every chest. I'll try and break everything possible. And then he's just like, no, I need to get to the next thing. I'm like, no, wait, I need to get through it. I need to collect everything.
And I totally get the completionist impulse. I'm right there with you. If it's breakable, I need to break it. If it's collectible, I need to collect it.
Yeah.
But yeah, like I have taught multiple video game studies courses at this point. Again, early career academic. But even before then, I've given guest lectures on various video game studies subjects. And whenever I start a course or a guest lecture, I ask who plays games. Mm. And I wait for people to put their hands up and then point out that the people who didn't put up their hands are, statistically speaking, liars.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Because like they don't think of themselves as playing games, but they'll like have Candy Crush on their phone, or Wordscapes, or they used to play like Farmville or Mafia Wars on Facebook back when that was a thing.
Love Farmville.
Right?
Yeah.
And that doesn't disqualify you from saying you play games. And a lot of people, because of the gatekeeping and the internalized shame around certain games, will not consider themselves gamers or will not consider themselves as playing games because, oh, these are just distractions. These aren't actual games. It's like, no, that's an artificial distinction. And you play games just as much as I do.